In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the events that led to the American Revolution. In the previous lesson, we learned that the French-Indian War led to tremendous debt for Great Britain. And in order to recover these debts that Great Britain had incurred, they decide to tax the colonists. And the first of these taxes was the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act placed a tax or duty on all paper in the colonies. Now, the biggest problem with the Stamp Act was that it was a direct tax that the colonists had to pay on top of the price of the paper that they were buying. Now, they were not used to direct taxes. They were used to inclusive taxes, like those that we pay when we buy a soda from a machine or a candy bar. We do not pay tax when we buy, we do pay tax when we buy a candy bar or a soda, but it is included in the price. They were used to these types of taxes, indirect tax, and the Stamp Act was different because it was a direct tax, which they were quite upset about because they were reminded constantly of the tax that they were paying. Like was said before, the colonists, they did not believe the king or parliament should impose taxes. And the main reason that they thought this way was because the colonists had no representation in Parliament. This led to the chant of the colonists that there should be no taxation without representation. So one of the biggest problems that the colonists had with the imposing of taxes upon them by Parliament was the colonists had no representation in Parliament. Now, the main tactic by which the colonists fought the taxes was the boycott. The boycott, which would hurt the British economy because the colonies would not buy their products, would eventually cause the Stamp Act to be repealed. So the colonists start to not buy British products, which is a type of economic, more or less, warfare. So the Stamp Act eventually was repealed. However, fearful that the boycotts would not be enforced, led to the creation of the Sons of Liberty, whose main tactic was tarring and feathering those who would buy British products that were under boycott. There's some examples that you saw yesterday of tarring and feathering. Now, there was also Daughters of Liberty who, due to the fact that the colonists were boycotting British products, they had to find substitutes. Even though during the Stamp Act there was not a boycott on textiles, the Daughters of Liberty would be well known for their spinning bees, where they made homemade clothes when the colonists were boycotting textiles. This brings us to the next part of the lesson. And the next part of the lesson is when Parliament once again tries to tax the colonists to recoup the losses that were fought during the French-Indian War. Now, the discussion in Parliament went something like this. That Stamp Act never worked too well. They're like, yes, it never. The boycott stopped it. They're like, yeah, but we still need money. We're paying over half our national income on interest on that loan. They're like, yes, let's try other taxes. They're like, well, it better not be a direct tax, because those colonists were really mad about the direct tax. They said, no, we're going to try an indirect tax again. That way, they are not so upset. Now, this indirect tax, which would raise the price of the colonists' goods, but it was paid by the merchants, so they really didn't know what it was. It was called the Townshend duties. The Townshend duties was a tax on several things, but it was an indirect tax. One of those things was paint. Also, paper was taxed again, like before. Also was a tax on tea. However, because it was an indirect tax, the colonists just realized that the price of these things went up. But the colonists were much more intelligent than Parliament thought, and they're like, why has the price of everything gone up? And they did some investigation, and they figured out that Parliament had passed a new tax, except it was an indirect tax. They're like, oh, they're trying to tax us again. Well, we just won't buy them. Nah, 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 nah. Like, what would they do if they don't buy them to hurt the British economy? Yes, they would boycott them. So, after some period of time, the boycott eventually was effective, and like the Stamp Act, Parliament repealed the Townshend duties. Said, well, I guess they caught on to our plan, and they repealed the Townshend duties just like the Stamp Act, except they left the tax on tea. Now comes an episode in history, and it all centers around the Townshend duties and the remaining tax that was left on tea. So, to repeat what was said, the Townshend duties were passed in 1767, and it was an indirect tax. It was an import tax on paint, paper, tea, and other goods. The colonists were unwilling to accept an import tax such as this because it was designed to collect money, and they knew it. So they boycott these goods, and eventually, like the Stamp Act before, Parliament repealed the Townshend duties except for the tax on tea. Now, the next part of the lesson concerns a company in Britain. And the company in Britain that was in trouble was called the East India Tea Company. And Parliament, having an interest in keeping the East India Tea Company successful, decides to pass a law to make them able to sell tea cheaper. They gave them exclusive rights in the colonies to sell tea. And this law, which would help out the East India Tea Company, was called the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act was not a tax. It was a law that gave the British East India Company exclusive rights to sell tea in the colonies. So, once again, the Tea Act is not a tax. You already had that written, but I need to emphasize it. And what it was Parliament is helping out a company by giving them exclusive rights. They pass laws to help the British East India Tea Company. Now, what this means is that actually the tea is going to become cheaper in the colonies. However, due to the fact of the Townshend duties, the colonists are still boycotting tea. Now, this is hard for the colonists because they love tea. So, the colonists, no, you can't mess with me. No tea for us. We're boycotting it. And they're like, wait, it's cheaper? Well, maybe if it's cheaper. I really like it. Now, the Sons of Liberty were worried about the possible breaking of the boycott. So, they come up with a plan to send a message to the British and to the colonists that pretty much they're winning this economic warfare against the British, and that they need to keep it up because Britain is running out of options here. So, the Sons of Liberty, who of course we know them for the tarring and feathering of people and making sure they enforce those boycotts with intimidation and persuasion, they're like, hey, the colonists might buy this cheap tea. We better do something. Well, what can we do? Well, we can send a message to the colonists and the British that they're not going to trick us by having cheap tea. And the message that they send is the following. It is when a group of colonists, which were curiously disguised as Native Americans, they sneak on board a British tea ship and they throw the tea into the water, destroying the tea. The value of which was several $million in today's money, maybe even tens of millions of dollars. And this event is well known throughout history. You probably know the name of it. And I'm sure you do. Yes, you're thinking correct. It is the Boston Tea Party. So the Boston Tea Party, which resulted because of the Tea Act, was really like a message to the colonists not to break the boycott on tea. Here's some of what was repeated. So the Tea Act was passed in 1773. It was not a tax, but instead gave the East India Tea Company exclusive rights, what we know as a monopoly, to sell tea to the colonies. This is because the East India Tea Company was having financial problems and Parliament wanted to help them out. The colonists' response to the Tea Act was they continued to boycott tea, but the colonists were worried, especially the Sons of Liberty, that the boycott might be broken by the colonists who love tea and might be tricked by the cheaper tea. So the Boston Tea Party of 1773 occurred. Here's a painting of it where they threw the tea overboard and showed the British what they thought of their tea. Here's another picture of the Boston Tea Party. Like I said, curiously, they disguised themselves as Native Americans when they did this. Now, lesser known was that Georgetown and Charlestown also had small tea parties. So, a lot of the protests in South Carolina were to the Tea Act. The Stamp Act and Tea Act were the two main acts that were protested in the Carolinas. And evidence of this was through the tea parties that were held in Charlestown and Georgetown, where they threw tea off the ship there too. Quite an organized effort, being that Boston is about almost 500 miles away. And they also did not allow tea to be sold. So, like was said before, Charlestown and Georgetown, they also had tea parties, and they did not allow tea to be sold. Smaller tea parties, not on the scale of Boston, but still, colonists from South Carolina climbed on board ships in Charlestown and Georgetown and threw the tea into the ocean. They also did not allow tea to be sold. Now, the British response to the Boston Tea Party was very harsh. It wasn't violent, but it was a strengthening of the British presence in the colonies, and also economic sanctions of their own. So in Parliament, they're pretty much thinking, tea parties, these colonists are bad. We have to do something to punish the colonies. And what they passed, what was the result of the Boston Tea Party, was what's known as the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were 5 acts that were really bad for the colonists. One of these acts, which once again were lumped into the whole group of the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston ports. So the British are mad at the people of Boston, and they said, you want to throw our tea into the ocean and ruin it? We're going to blockade your port and close it until that tea is paid for. Millions of dollars, almost impossible to recoup this sum. So, once again, the Intolerable Acts were the result from the Boston Tea Party. The British passed these Intolerable Acts from the Boston Tea Party and the smaller tea parties that were held in Carolinas in response to the Tea Act. Now, the Intolerable Acts, you do not have to know them all, but they involved the closing of the Boston ports. They also involved a stipulation upon the Massachusetts legislature. Also, no royal official committing a capital offense could be tried in Massachusetts, so almost immunity for the royal officials in Massachusetts. One of the most intolerable of the Intolerable Acts was the Quartering Act, which basically put people, British soldiers, into people's homes for them to look out for, provide food and shelter for. So they lived with people like roommates. This, of course, was very hard for the colonists to take. Also, the Quebec Act. But the important thing, the effect of the Boston Tea Party was the passage of these intolerable acts to punish the colonists. In the next lesson, we are going to learn about the colonists' response to the intolerable acts, which you probably have already figuring that part out, and the events that eventually would push the colonies from a policy of using economics to deter British taxation to the violent fighting of a war. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.